He reproached my mother for having kept silent and assured her that Fouché had acted on his own initiative and not on the emperor's behalf. Nevertheless, he questioned the empress as to what she thought about the matter. She replied that she would never take the first steps to bring out a change which would separate her from him. She said she considered their destiny had been so extraordinary that it had certainly been directed by Providence, and she believed she would bring misfortune on both of them if, of her own accord, she sought to separate their two lives. The emperor showed that he was touched, adopted the same affectionate attitude toward her as in the past, and the project seemed to have been entirely put aside. Yet the incident had aroused apprehension in my mother's heart. The talk going about Paris in regard to a possible divorce was being repeated to her all the time, and it so greatly disturbed her peace of mind that I frequently wondered whether in the end it would not be better for her if the divorce became an accomplished fact. The emperor left for Italy. While there, he conferred the title of Prince of Venice on the viceroy, Eugene. This title was also that of the heir to the Italian throne, and Eugene's new honor aroused much comment. I did not know what to think and began to believe that the question of a separation had never been considered seriously by the emperor. During the emperor's trip to Italy, my mother frequently came to see me. For having returned to Paris, I was obliged to remain constantly on my chaise longue. The princes whom I had received informally at Fontainebleau continued to attend my evening receptions regularly. They all had some requests to make. The unfortunate position they were in made me sympathize with them, and I took the greatest pains to make them forget that they were doubly in a position of inferiority, being vanquished enemies, living as strangers in the land of those who had conquered them. Consequently, they seemed to enjoy coming to my home more than going elsewhere, and in spite of all the amusements, balls, and other entertainments the capital offered, they never missed dropping in to see me, at least for a few moments. They often told me that they felt at my house as if they were in the midst of their own family circle, and that a sister could not have given them better advice than they received from me. If I ever find myself in an embarrassing position, the Grand Duke of Würzburg, brother of the Emperor of Austria, one day said to me, "I shall ask you what I should do." I can readily imagine that my advice was useful, for it sprang from a sincere sympathy for their misfortunes. On New Year's Day, I gave little gifts to all my household and my intimate friends. I suggested to the princes that they consider themselves included among the latter and attend the festivities. It was a real family party. Among other presents, I gave a portrait by Isabel of the young Russian princess, whom her husband, the Prince of Mecklenburg, mourned so bitterly. The portrait formed the cover of a box. The emperor's return put an end to these visits. He was very severe regarding the manner in which foreigners were to be received, and declared that they should be admitted only to the fashionable clubs and not to our homes. Prince William of Prussia had just arrived, and as Prussia was protesting against a number of things, people thought it was his presence that caused this rule to be made. On the other hand, the princes, vexed at being forbidden to call on us, sought refuge in the drawing rooms of the royalist Faubourg Saint-Germain, where they heard the emperor spoken of in a manner which doubtless was more in accordance with their personal feelings. One day the emperor was blaming me for having received them and said, "Are there not enough Frenchmen in the world that you have to invite foreigners who can never care for us whatever happens? But of course they have such nice manners, and ladies always seek to make themselves agreeable to everyone." "Ah, sire," I interrupted, shocked by his last remark. "I am too anxious that they have a good opinion of my conduct to seek to make myself too agreeable to them." The emperor smiled and said nothing more about the matter. At the time, he had made up his mind to marry my mother's cousin, Stephanie Tascher, to the Duke d'Arenberg. He was a nice, clever boy, but not attractive. His family, which was most respectable, was very anxious for the match. The wedding was performed at my house. All the young man's relatives from Brussels and Germany were present. The emperor and empress also attended the ceremony. Princess Stephanie did not appear extremely enthusiastic about her husband, although her caprice for general rep was entirely a thing of the past. For the last 2 years, she had remained constantly at Saint-Germain. I heard later that the Prince of the Asturias had wished to marry her and had made a formal request for her hand. The ambassador from Württemberg had presented a similar request on behalf of the Crown Prince of Württemberg, but the emperor declined to consider either of these. The new couple were not at all happy. I was never able to persuade Stephanie to go to Brussels to see her husband's family, who were very anxious to have her do so. She was kind and gentle, even easygoing as regarded the details of her daily life, but obstinate in her opinions and over-romantic in her emotions. She had the melancholy courage 7 years later to have her marriage annulled on the ground of constraint, and later she married the Comte de Guitry, my mother's equerry. At the same time, another marriage took place at the house of Princess Caroline, that of Murat's niece with the heir of the Hohenzollern family. The prince's mother was present. It was the second time she had come to Paris since so many changes had taken place in our private fortunes. She had done much to keep her husband on his throne, and we were pleased to think that our long friendship had proved useful to his dynasty. I recalled how kind she had been to us during the Revolution, and I always received her at my house as though she were my mother. She often repeated that she should have wished to confer a title on me. As of all human weaknesses, the one most common in Germany is a desire to be related to royalty. The princess would have preferred to have her son marry some young member of our family rather than a relative of the Murat, whose rise in station she considered rather too recent. Nevertheless, the marriage was a success, and the couple are still happy. Nothing more was said about the divorce, but everything indicated to me that the emperor was torn between a desire to have a son and heir and a reluctance to separate from the woman whom he loved and who had always been so devoted to him. A few days before he left for Bayonne, I entered his drawing room to say goodbye. My mother was just leaving the room. The emperor was sitting down and seemed thoughtful and preoccupied. As he saw me enter, he did not stir, but looked at me closely without saying a word. The time for my confinement was very near. Suddenly he exclaimed, "It hurts me to see you like that. How I would love your mother if she were in that condition." Then he again lost himself in thought until the empress returned. This preoccupation, the sudden exclamation that had escaped him, all seemed to me to prove that he was obsessed and tortured by the idea of a divorce. Nevertheless, he left with my mother for the south of France, and she was not worried as long as he was at Bayonne, where his attention was wholly absorbed by negotiations with Spain. Thus, I found myself alone in Paris, a prey to all my mental anguish, without any consolation other than that which I could find in the company of my ladies in waiting and the officers of my household. I was convinced myself that the end of my confinement would also be the end of my earthly life, and I did not dread to see this end approaching. I had become more and more attached to my surviving son. His delicate health required my constant care. But his father's wish that the boy should join him in Holland frightened me and made me foresee further misfortunes. The child fell dangerously ill of a tertian fever. In spite of my own ill health, I did not leave his bedside, and I felt that other sufferings were still in store for me. As had been agreed, Adele wrote me when occasion offered an exact account of whatever went on in Holland that concerned me. My husband had not been able to prevent public prayers being offered for my recovery, but when surrounded by his courtiers, he made biting remarks about me, which wounded Adele to the heart. He talked about me often with her at this period, telling of the violent love with which I had inspired him, and of the way in which I had ruined his life. He wished always to put all the blame on me, but could find only imaginary wrongs of which to accuse me. His unfortunate character caused him constantly to think up new grounds for suspicion, which embittered his feelings still more. One day the king sent for his surgeon, a man skilled in his art, but rough and uneducated. "I am counting on you," the king said, "to do me a great service. People are anxious that I should go to Paris and be present at the queen's confinement. Perhaps this is a plan to deceive me. Perhaps the child has already been born. I think, in fact, this is what has happened. You should certainly be able to tell if her pregnancy is a simulated one. The excuse for your trip will be to take my son back with you." On leaving the king, the surgeon told Monsieur de Broc of the errand he was being sent on, and Madame de Broc hastened to communicate with me. At the same time, she advised me to receive the surgeon and take every precaution to convince him of the actual state of my health in order that he might reassure my husband and calm his constantly increasing uneasiness. Her letter was sent me in a shoe, which the surgeon brought with him, little guessing what the package contained. Imagine my state of mind on learning what low means of espionage my husband employed. He dared put my reputation at the mercy of an utter stranger. The passion which blinded my husband's reason caused him to forget all the prayers he had uttered, the efforts he had made, and the resistance he had been forced to overcome in order to secure our reconciliation. Was he not teaching me that there is a point beyond which the most obstinate desire to ensure another person's happiness cannot go? Was it not he who was breaking the mournful chain of duty which I had once more consented to assume? From that day on, my mind was made up. I would never again return to him. I was at my son's bedside, suffering from the most intense mental anguish, the result of all the foregoing thoughts, when the surgeon was announced. "Enter, monsieur," I said. "Look at me closely, and you can report to the king the exact condition in which you found me." The man stammered, attributed the idea of sending him on such a mission to my husband's ill health and to his natural cast of mind. When he returned to Holland and told the king what had taken place, Louis, unable to believe that anyone could have betrayed him, sent for Monsieur de Broc and declared I must be mad to have spoken in such a manner. Who is the person whose health and strength could resist such constantly repeated insults and misfortunes? My health had received a fatal blow. It would doubtless have given way completely if the presence of my unborn child had not once more animated my courage. But nothing could dispel a dark and gloomy tinge that colored all my thoughts. Following the surgeon's depressing visit, I daily felt violent pains that seemed to indicate the approach of my confinement. A month went by, and I became accustomed to them. I counted that there was still another week to wait. Caroline came and invited me to take my son to a party she was given that evening for her children. I accepted and drove there, lying in my carriage and taking all the precautions my condition rendered necessary. But even this simple outing brought on more severe pains. Tightrope dancers executing their performances near the children, and who I constantly feared would fall on my son, increased my nervousness. High Chancellor Cambaceres, who, according to the law, was obliged to be present at my confinement, was constantly expecting a summons on account of my increasing weakness. That evening, as he was not at all well himself, he came up to me and said, I see your majesty at a reception. I need not expect to be called tonight, and with your permission I shall return home and have leeches applied." "You may leave," I replied. "I hope you will not be disturbed." A few moments after his departure, my pains became so violent that I had no further doubt that I was about to give birth to my child. I quickly climbed back into my carriage and scarcely had time to reach home. My accoucheur was sent for, and the authorities who were obliged to attend me on that occasion were notified. My equerry, Monsieur de la Ville, who was sent to summon the High Chancellor, found him still suffering from the effect of being leeched. Nevertheless, since he was a punctilious observer of etiquette, he obeyed the summons, although in a condition which aroused the mirth of all Paris. In the night of the 20th and the 21st of April, 1808, I gave birth to a son. I should have preferred a daughter, but the announcement that the baby was a boy caused my mother great joy, and the emperor ordered a salute to be fired all along the Spanish border where he then was. The birth of a second possible heir to the throne fitted in admirably with his political plans. In order to convey the news to him officially, I dispatched my French chamberlain as messenger, at the same time sending my Dutch chamberlain, Count Beelant, to take the news to my husband. The king had the event announced to his subjects from the palace balcony and received the customary congratulations. I learned later that the surgeon had declared in the drawing room, "Queens have the right to be pregnant a shorter time than other women. They do not count as ordinary people do." My son was so delicate that I feared from his birth I should lose him. It was necessary to bathe him in wine and wrap him up in cotton in order to keep him alive. I did not care whether I lived or not myself. My gloomy forebodings concerning the future made the idea of death quite bearable. In fact, I was so convinced that my last day had come that I asked my physician whether I could survive another 24 hours. My condition seemed to him quite inexplicable. As a matter of fact, it grew worse steadily. A visit from Monsieur de Talleyrand added to my sense of discomfort and affected my nerves in a disagreeable manner. He was one of the officials who were supposed to be in attendance when my son was born. He always wore his hair powdered. The smell of the powder was so strong that when he came close to me to express his good wishes, I thought I should suffocate. I did not dare say anything as long as he remained, but I felt that his presence was bad for me. My mental anguish still further increased the seriousness of my physical condition. Utter discouragement came over me, and I thought I was about to die. It was then that my pulse ceased to beat regularly and that my consumption began to develop. No longer was I insensible to pain. On the contrary, everything affected me and alarmed me. If my son happened to be ill, I thought he was dying. If I left the house for a moment, my imagination would conjure up pictures of the terrible things that might happen during my absence. I stared anxiously at the first person I met and was not reassured until I was back again with my children. If a man rode along beside my carriage, I fancied he had been thrown off, and I felt the wheels go over his body. If people picked up my son, I sprang forward, for he seemed to be slipping from their grasp. Yet since I continued to live on in spite of all the sufferings provoked by my nervous condition, it must have been because my destiny willed it. It was necessary that I should continue to live and suffer. Queen of Holland, Princess of France, mother of two princes, sole heirs to the most glorious throne of Europe, I spent my days in sorrow and wretchedness of spirit. How often did I envy the lot of those whose lives are spent in the midst of their family and friends, who can be cared for and comforted without attracting the curiosity of strangers. But royalty has no family. Mine was scattered. My brother lived far away. My mother was not with me. My husband's jealous nature had estranged all my old friends. No one was left who could console me and sympathize with my troubles. Condemned to lie day after day on a chaise longue, my only amusement was to sing old ballads to the accompaniment of my guitar. And I was too worn out for even that mild recreation. My lungs had become so delicate that singing was forbidden me. I resigned myself to the spectacle of watching what natural talents I possessed disappear, and my gloomy fancy intensified my physical ailments, since it conjured up imaginary ills in addition to my real ones. The continued weakness of my newborn child, which made me very uneasy, remedied for a while my general prostration. The baby nearly died. It became necessary to change his nurse, and I went myself to a village to secure a new one. But this brief revival of energy due to my maternal anxiety cost me dearly. I took cold while caring for my son and was afflicted with terrific headaches. Will my readers believe me? I enjoyed this physical pain. It banished for a short time that moral depression which is so bitter, so exhausting to a heart overflowing with grief. As a climax to all my troubles, the emperor's family took exception to the fact that I was staying on in France. My husband's mother declared openly that I had abandoned her son when he was ill, unhappy and wretched, because I was not with him. At a time when I was wasting away before their very eyes, when the doctors had given up all hope of my recovery, and when I did not dare speak of the grief that gnawed at my bosom, it was still I who was considered in the wrong. The thought of my returning to Holland made me tremble. Yet, if I did not do so, the public, not understanding the reasons which prompted my actions, would severely condemn me. On the other hand, if I did go, would not my reputation suffer at least as much from the remarks and attitude of a husband such as mine? What a piteous dilemma I was in. One day, Madame Campan came to see me. She understood my character and guessed how miserable I was. "Do not let yourself pine away," she said to me with tears in her eyes. "I know how discouraged you are, but it is necessary to face life as it is. Live on, and in the end your conduct will be appreciated and more fairly judged. What good could such advice do to a broken spirit?"